Now, before Rishi Sunak decided to throw the Spectator's weekly rhythm out of sync, we were running with our cover this week, which was Electric Shock, which is a fascinating piece by Ross Clark about the great electric vehicle bust. It's a very important subject, and Ross has explored it very well. I'm delighted to be joined by Rory Sutherland, the wiki man, our Spectator wiki man, who's also written a lot about electric vehicles over the years. Quite a fan, Rory is, of electric vehicles. And if I could just find Ross's article. Rory, I thought I'd start by putting to you a bit from Ross's piece, where Ross says, if there ever was a real-world demonstration of the old proverb, you can lead a horse to water, it is electric cars. And what he's referring to there is the fact that governments the world over, particularly Western governments, have, because of green ideology to a certain extent, pushed their publics and pushed the car industry towards electric vehicles with huge incentives and mandates and so on. And yet the electric car market is not really functioning as required. It's having a bit of a breakdown on the side of the road. What do you think about Ross's thesis? Do you agree with it?
I think that if you look at my opinion on this, I think the natural path of migration of cars, as with more or less every other device which makes something rotate, in this case a drive shaft, I think the natural path of travel is towards electrification. And I think there are reasons to be hopeful about electrification, not least in that electric motors allow you to miniaturize cars and other vehicles in a way that the internal combustion engine doesn't. There are other advantages. For example, you can produce electricity with more or less any fuel or any source of energy, including nuclear, whereas electric cars run on crude oil, effectively. Electric cars are omnivorous. So there are lots of reasons, I think, to believe that that's the direction of travel. And there are arguments for accelerating that direction of travel because obviously it's dependent on things like charging infrastructure. However, I think government attempts to mandate the pace of change are very possibly wrong-headed. Just to give one example, I don't really see what the objection is to plug-in hybrid cars. If people are too nervous to have an electric car, or if most of the time they only drive very short distances and merely use the internal combustion engine for the rare occasions when they drive further, out of town, for example, for a Londoner, the plug-in hybrid seems a pretty good compromise, or at least a kind of gateway drug to electrification. But there is a problem here which actually I should have anticipated and the market should have anticipated, which is you do run out of early adopters in a market quite quickly. There is always a kind of, it's sometimes called in marketing crossing the chasm. In other words, it's reasonably easy to produce a new product which gets adopted by the 10% of the population who are, to put it very casually, kind of relatively wealthy novelty seekers. But for that product to actually then migrate to the mainstream or to what's called sort of, early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, and then, the mass market, isn't always that easy. That's complicated by the fact, by the way, that not many people actually buy cars from new. The electric car, I think, has done very well in the fleet market and the corporate leasing market, not least because there are very generous tax concessions. Actually, the average age, for example, of someone who buys a Volkswagen Golf from new is somewhere between like 58 and 64. Okay, most people in their 20s, 30s, 40s don't actually buy new cars unless they're on some sort of company lease scheme. And so what you're looking for with the electric car is actually quite a small market, which is the people who are novelty seekers who also buy a new car. Now, you could argue that the fall off in demand is going to be the solution to its own problem, in that if secondhand prices of electric cars fall fairly dramatically, as seems to be the case, well, you are at least solving the problem of affordability. But there are some worries there. I think Ross is right to worry about the Chinese who made this mistake, massively overproduced electric cars, and are now effectively going to be dumping them on, either the European or the American market.
Yes.
That's kind of an unfair threat to the indigenous car industry, I think. And it is, in some ways, for consumers, you might argue it's a bit of a bonanza, at least to those consumers who are adventurous enough to actually go electric. But this probably isn't ideal, I have to say. And I blame myself a little bit, because as an evangelist for electric cars, regardless of any environmental message, by the way, I will argue that they are better cars. My previous car was a 5-litre Jaguar V8 XJ, and I switched to a Ford Mustang Mach-E, a cheaper car, certainly from new, and it's better. Okay, it's markedly better. All kinds of reasons: one pedal driving, regenerative braking, quietness, and actually a bizarre kind of combination of being a limousine when you wanted to be a limousine and a go-kart when you wanted to be a go-kart. In lots and lots of respects, we're now a 2-car electric household. Once you have home charging, the whole issue with charging is actually, to be honest, a distraction. Unless you're one of these people. In the comments on my last Spectator piece is someone who said, I need to drive to Glasgow and back from northwest London in a day. Well, personally, I think that person is mad. I think that's what trains and aeroplanes are for. But nonetheless, if you are that person, you probably shouldn't buy an electric car. You should buy a diesel.
Is the problem, Rory, that governments are trying to do different things at once? They're trying to placate the car industry and show the car industry a way forward, which the car industry have hopped on board with, at the same time as they're trying to encourage electric car use by everyone for net zero targets and so on, at the same time as they want to block out Chinese cars because the Americans are doing it, because they want to protect their domestic car industries. Related to that question, what do you think Rishi Sunak should do about this abundance of Chinese EVs that are going to be dumped, a bit like fentanyl or steel is being dumped all around the world when China has an oversupply?
My personal view is that the extent to which, in some cases, broadly speaking, as I say, I support electrification as a direction of travel. I support renewable energy in terms of a direction of travel. But I think we have a kind of precedent in the case of mandated fluorescent bulbs, the way in which we got rid of the incandescent bulb. And we got rid of it about 2 years too early because we mandated that everybody bought these piece of crap bulbs that took 10 minutes to reach full brightness. Okay. And then 2 years later, LED lighting came along, which rendered the whole thing completely moot. And I think I'm very uncomfortable with mandated timescales that are universally applied. I think as far as possible, I would encourage people whose motoring requirements are, within normal range and who have their own driveway. I would encourage those people to at least consider an electric car because I think they're very, very good. I mean, looked at from the point of view of an alien, the internal combustion engine is an insanely complicated mechanism for simply rotating a shaft. Okay, all those parts, the air filter, the oil filter, the tappets, the big end, the cylinders, the gearbox, okay, all of those things are eliminated in an electric car. It's electricity in, rotation out. Okay, so there are, there's a very good reason why your toothbrush, I assume you have an electric toothbrush, doesn't run on an internal combustion engine. There's a very good reason why radio-controlled helicopters, in my childhood, they ran on tiny little sort of one-stroke or two-stroke engines. Okay, they don't anymore. Okay, the movement of travel should be electric, and the government should at least, the very least, kind of encourage that. And I might also add that people go, it's disgusting that my taxes went to subsidising you having a new electric car. Can I make the point that anybody who buys a car from new is practicing a massive form of wealth redistribution through voluntary means? If you go and buy a new Jag, Freddie, what it means is that 4 years later, someone will be able to buy a really, really good car for half the price you paid. If only the property market worked like that. I've got this 3-bedroom house in Mayfair, but I've used it for 3 years, so you can have it for half price. Okay, you are a massively generous social person, because it means that someone half as wealthy as you can have a car that's nearly as good as yours.
Rory, let me interrupt. Isn't the key word voluntary there?
Yes, absolutely. I don't think it's wrong in the early days of a technology for a government to at least make sure that I was very much in favour of a light touch on vaping. Because I think, in the early days of a technology, the natural reaction is kind of fear and hostility. It's worth noting, by the way, I'm old enough to remember in 1989, I used a mobile phone on Oxford Street and two people shouted abuse at me from passing cars. Okay, right. Most technologies encounter quite a lot of hostility in their early days, sometimes deservedly, sometimes not.
You touch on what could be the key point here, which is that innovation always comes up with something unexpected that government action hasn't provided for and that markets can provide for. And that might be, in the case of cars, self-driving cars, which might come along just at the moment as the EV market is ready to go. And in fact, will replace it entirely.
Or actually, mini cars. Somewhere between the electric cargo bike and the car, there is the opportunity for an electric car which people use for short-range journeys. It's kind of absurd. I take a four-seater car to my local station 3 miles away with a bloody great battery weighing a ton, okay? To be honest, for that journey, what I need is some sort of micro vehicle.
Yes.
Okay. The Citroën Ami isn't a totally insane idea. It's probably a bit ahead of its time, but I can see the micro car being quite a major solution here because they don't need very big batteries. They don't need huge range. In fact, in the case of the Citroën Ami, you just plug it into a 3-pin socket. You don't even need a charger. But I agree with you that I think that the attempt to take a kind of theoretical ideal, set a timeline for it, and impose it on the market without allowing the market to do its ingenious best. And we have, exactly the case of those, fluorescent light bulbs, which were ghastly, There's also a problem, by the way, which is a psychological one. I mentioned the fact that not many people buy new cars. Okay, it's a narrow slice of the market that buys cars from new, and they tend to be much, much older and therefore potentially more conservative. Who knows? Okay, less experimental. There's also the problem that 25 years of experience, if you are over 50, actually 50 years of experience, has taught you that with electrical goods, it always pays to wait. Okay, the people who bought the first flat screen televisions paid an insane premium for a not particularly good plasma screen. LCD came along, changes the game. I think there's potential for a similar game-changing invention in electric locomotion, to be honest. But you're right in the sense that a lot of people have this instinctive feeling if it's got a plug of some kind, okay, and it's relatively new, the trick is to wait 5 years. Until the problems have been ironed out or human ingenuity has had the opportunity to do its best.
Well, and a problem that a lot of people want to get ironed out is batteries, which, as Ross says towards the end of his piece, they're all. China seems to have cornered the market to a large extent. British attempts to develop our own battery market have been pretty unsuccessful for electric cars. And until this gets ironed out or becomes a more competitive market by itself, the EV market is going to struggle. The bigger EV market is going to struggle.
Yes, I mean, again, one of the things I think that's often true in terms of migrating people, there's a concept in design called MAYA, which is maximally advanced yet acceptable. And it comes from Raymond Loewy, the designer, who said that it's your job to produce something that's notably better than what preceded it, but not so weirdly different that people find it unrecognizable or alarming or simply can't make sense of it. I don't understand the antipathy to plug-in hybrids, which seem to me a pretty good compromise, okay? Most of your journeys, if you do plug them in, are going to be electric with all the benefits that brings. One thing with my electric car, I very rarely use the brakes at all. Okay, I took my car in for a service and they said the brakes are fine and the tires are fine. I said, what about all the other stuff? They said, there isn't any other stuff. Okay, there are huge advantages to this. But actually, the plug-in hybrid seems to me actually a pretty healthy compromise if someone reduces not 100% of their carbon emissions. And I don't think this is all about carbon, by the way, anyway. Okay. But if someone reduces a very large part of their carbon emissions, but still has an electric, an internal combustion engine for longer range journeys, and therefore has a lighter, smaller battery, that doesn't strike me. That doesn't strike me as anything insane about this. It's very similar to the argument about heat pumps, where to get a grant for a heat pump, you have to rip out your whole boiler and your central heating system. Okay, well, I'd like to keep them in reserve, if you don't mind. I'm quite happy getting a heat pump which maybe reduces my use of gas by 80%. I'm not going to get rid of my boiler just yet, if you don't mind. That's kind of a leap in the dark. And interestingly, if you want to know a very interesting thing about heat pumps, an air conditioning unit, which you can install one room at a time for about £1,500, which is a very, very long established technology made by recognizable companies like, Mitsubishi and so forth. That's a heat pump. You can install an air conditioning unit and run it in reverse. It has basically the same level of efficiency. It's an air-to-air heat pump. And you can keep your boiler for really, really cold spells. Why don't you get a grant for that? And I asked my brother, he's doing this whole air conditioning thing. He's an astrophysicist, so he knows all the bloody mathematics and the physics involved, okay? And he said, it's very simple. They don't want people installing air conditioning units because you might use them for air conditioning. Okay, which would then increase energy consumption. To which my answer is, mate, this is the UK, okay? That's a reasonable, I think, objection to air conditioning units if you're in Algeria or if you're in southern Italy or if you're in Greece. In the UK, a lot of happy people would enjoy air conditioning for the 2 weeks of the year when it's painfully hot, and they'd have a heat pump for the rest of the year. They could still keep their boiler, which they'd use if it were just egregiously cold for a couple of weeks. I think that's a happy compromise many people could adopt, which is MEA, maximally advanced yet acceptable. It's what an evolutionary biologist, as I said in this week's article, would call the adjacent possible. You can get people to do that. The number of people who'll spend £40,000 in one go ripping out their boiler and their radiators, digging up their lawn to install piping, the number of people who'll do that rather than, say, having a holiday in the Maldives with the available money is very, very small, and they're probably enormously rich to begin with. So why the hell are we subsidising them?
Well, quite. Rory, I'm afraid I'm going to have to unplug you there because we're running out of time. But thank you very much indeed. It's always fascinating to talk to you about any subject, and particularly one as curious as this. Thank you, Rory.
It's a joy, Freddie. Thanks very much.